Washington Post and the Pentagon and the Department of Justice and the FBI yesterday, yet another war game over a civil war. So let's go back to the slide there, Travis. So Revolutionary War, which took 21 years, unlike the Depression and World War II, which ran out over a period of 17 years, the Civil War was pretty short. It was only 4 years. And of course, Hannah Jones does not know that since she doesn't know the dates. The person who did Project 1619, she has no idea when the Civil War was even fought, or the fact that it was a very short turning. A lot of people, though, look at, and I'm one of those people, who believes that the Civil War did not really begin even before the Missouri Compromise. The things were starting to happen. I mean, some people trace it back to that. If you go back to 1850, then you have something that took about 15 years to go through, like most of these fourth turnings. But I really think if you want to understand what's going on with the Civil War, you have to understand that it was a major turning internationally. It wasn't just in America. It was also in Italy, as I pointed out many times. You had Garibaldi and his army were fighting a civil war in Italy at the time. There was no slavery involved in that. That was over the creation of the nation state. The nation state that was being created by the rise of industrial powers. So you had an industrial revolution that was there. And the wars that were fought in Italy and America in the 1860s and in other places around the world, those are wars that were fought over the political transfer of power from an agrarian to an industrial society. And as part of that, things were consolidated into a nation state. And so if you really want to understand that dynamic of it, the monetary aspect of it, certainly the were involved in that. You know, the South wanted to have no tariffs because they were exporters, and they knew there would be retaliatory measures taken on the products that they were trying to export. The North was, so the South represented an agrarian society. They wanted to be able to freely exchange their goods abroad. The North represented the rising industrial power, and they wanted to have a protected market trade. So if you go back, it goes back before the Missouri Compromise. At that point in time, you had a new tax that was imposed. The southern states called it the Tariff of Abomination. Tax on 92% of everything. There's only a few items that were exempted from this tax by the federal government. Remember, there was no direct taxation of individuals at the time. And so the only way that the federal government could do taxes was, or they would tax the states, and the states would then determine how they were going to raise that money from the people in their states. But this was going to be a 38% tax on 92% of everything. And it was in 1828. And it came very, very close to launching a civil war. As a matter of fact, you had the southern states, after they called it the Tariff of Abomination, it created a nullification crisis over the next few years. By 1832, and it lasted for about a year, they called it the nullification crisis. It was a resistance to these tariffs. And it started in South Carolina, just as you would later see Fort Sumter happening in South Carolina. It caused the resignation of Vice President John C. Calhoun. And the federal government responded with something that they called the Force Act. So again, you have trade disputes, economic disputes, kick off in 1828. They said, well, we're going to nullify those tariffs. They're abominable. And we're not going to participate with that. And so that nullification nearly kicked off a civil war. It didn't happen at that time, not necessarily because of the wise leadership of the people who were there. I believe it was because the timing was not right for the generation. In other words, it was 20 or 30 years too early. 30 years too early. And so that particular generation was able to find a compromise. Subsequent generation was ready to change this completely. And so that's one of the reasons why that happened. And you can see this even my very first program that I had, independent program at InfoWars back in 2017. Trump had just taken office that year, and the left were the ones that were talking about secession. And so my very first program, I talked to some people from California who wanted to secede and have self-government. And I wanted to wish them every success because I don't want California part of the U.S. either. No offense to the conservatives living there, but, you can, because of the drag, California has been like an anchor on our liberties. I would like to see them doing their own thing. Go for it. Do your own thing, California. That's what you're always about, right? So, but I had them on just to show that the impulse for self-government was capable of being an either tribe, and that it was not something that was fascist, for example. This is about your own self-governance, and the fact that this was something that was rising up in this polarization that has been happening even before Trump everywhere. Now, NPR says, imagine another civil war, but this time a civil war in every state. And we see NPR and we see the Washington Post, all of these organizations are pushing this, predicting, and this is predictive programming, normalizing it, preparing people for the fact that the opposing political tribe has to be shut down with force from the central government, of course. This is NPR. And yes, isn't it amazing that they're woke, as Tucker was telling everybody? It's like, seriously, when has NPR never been on the cutting edge of being woke? He says, oh, yeah, they're just crazy now. They've always been crazy. They were crazy when I was in college. Anyway, 1/3 of Americans, says NPR, thought that violence against the government was sometimes justified. Sometimes justified. You notice how they phrase that? What they're doing is they're portraying Americans as the ones who are initiating force against the government, not the other way around. What have we seen for the last 2 years? The government is coming in and saying, you do this or else, you do that or else. They're breaking the bonds of the Constitution, shattering them into a million pieces. They've been breaking the bonds of the Constitution for a long time. But they present those of us who are Americans, who say that it is sometimes justified. And they say, well, back in 1990s, it was only 1 out of 10 Americans that held that view. And now it's 3 times that many people. Maybe that's because of government actions, do you think? Because of government stepping over the line. They go on to say, let's assume that a civil war would not be a return to the 1860s when 11 states left. Well, that's why a lot of people say it was not a civil war. The states in the South were not trying to take over the northern states and run them, right? They just wanted to go their own way. So one of the reasons why Stonewall Jackson called it the Second War of Independence. They just saw it as something that the federal government was created by the states. They only delegated certain powers to them, and they believed that what was being done by the government in terms of tariffs and many other things, and again, with the slavery issue, they believed that that was a violation of what was in the contract, and they believed that they had a right to self-government more than anything else. A lot of the people who fought that made it clear that they were, it's pretty obvious that a few people that were involved in that. As a matter of fact, probably most of the rich plantation owners did not get involved in it. The people who were fighting it were the poor people who didn't have slaves for the most part, because they were concerned about their liberty. But we still see this put out, states' rights. This is what NPR says. And I've said that many times. There is no such thing as states' rights. There is no such thing as states' rights. That's one of the things that the South got wrong when they started talking about that. States have powers. And they have delegated federal government. And when you look at that in the 10th Amendment, 9th Amendment, 10th Amendment, they make it clear that if they didn't give those powers specifically to the government, that the government doesn't have it, and that those the states have power, and both of them delegated some of that power to the federal government. But to say that the creators of the federal government are now its subjects is not only absurd, but it's also a dangerous idea, because you know that the United States and many other sovereign states created the United Nations. And if you buy into that logic, then we could never leave the United Nations, or we could never shut them down when they extend their power in ways that has not been delegated to them. And that's essentially the viewpoint of what was happening at the time of the Civil War. So it is not states' rights. We need to understand that we have rights and powers as people. But they go on to say, says NPR, they note that conflicts between entire states are not the only way that civil war may emerge in our time, or even the most likely way for it to emerge. Yeah, this might be a real civil war that is coming up. And as I've said, it may be a revolutionary war, it may be a real civil war, and it may be a real World War II and a Great Depression. That may be what is coming up. So that is the concern about this fourth turning. It could be a very, very big one. America, says NPR, has an extraordinary number of guns and private militias. Semi-automatic weapons comprise about 19.8 million in total, making a highly armed population with potentially dangerous capabilities. You see what they're doing? Again, this government mouthpiece has portrayed Americans as the aggressors. Americans are the danger. Americans having arms is the problem. Well, what about the government running gain-of-function experiments? What about the government creating autonomous killer robots? And on and on and on. Is that a problem? Oh, no. No, we shouldn't be concerned about any of that. The problem is that you have a gun to defend yourself against people who step over the line, whether that's an individual criminal or whether it's a criminal who's waving a flag with a uniform. So they said, again, they take it to January the 6th. This has become their template now. This is what all this quote-unquote insurrection stuff is about. The January 6th attack on the Capitol, they said, was surprising, but it should not have been, because we've been watching American democracy decline since 2016. Why would they pick that date? Those of us who've been watching America's decline, I would take it back to the mid-1950s when we started having a Supreme Court that decided they were going to dictate the minutiae of our life without any authority, when they kicked God out of the schools and other things like that. But of course, they trace it back to the election of Donald Trump. Yeah, so January the 6th is the destruction of democracy, according to NPR. Not the lockdown. Not the lockdown. Not the lockdown, and I'm taking away everything from you and I'll give it back if you take this jab. Not that. No. It was the January the 6th issue. So they said, so now we look at this. A scholar of international law says the U.S. used to be considered to be a full democracy like Norway or Switzerland or Iceland. And now it's considered to be a partial democracy like Ecuador, Somalia, or Haiti. When we look at this, folks, it is a question of slavery. And I would agree with them. I would say that in terms of us being a democratic republic, and the republic is more important than the Democrat side of it, right? That is far more important. If you don't want to live your life at the dictates of an unelected bureaucracy that does taxation without representation, does legislation without representation, that's where we are today. I wouldn't say that we're democratic at all. I mean, who would say that if we were living at the arbitrary whims of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, all they have to do is call themselves some kind of a public health official and they can order you to do anything. And then you have people armed and in uniform who are willing to carry out those unconstitutional orders. How in the world is that even a partial democracy? The question should be, are we slaves? And that takes us back to the Civil War again, right? When you look at the Civil War, if it was over slavery, and I think it was over many other things, I think that was just one manifestation of the agrarian versus industrialized society at the point that happened. But today we are talking about a potential civil war over slavery, because these people are coming for you. They have forged the chains with their high-tech devices. They are electronic. They are about surveillance. And if you don't understand that, you don't really understand where we are. So yesterday we had Microsoft News talking about a guerrilla war exercise to be fought across rural North Carolina counties, warns the Army. Now, this is coming from a wargaming situation called Robin Sage. They've done this for a long time, but at certain times they like to make a big issue out of it. At certain important junctures, they like to tell everybody about Robin Sage. And in the past, we've had war games from the American War College